What if I told you that World War II might have been lost without African contributions, but you've probably never heard their names in any history class? Over 1.2 million African soldiers served in World War II, fighting on more fronts than most European armies. These weren't just support troops. They were frontline combat soldiers who participated in the war's most crucial battles. The West African Frontier Force became legendary for jungle warfare expertise in Burma against Japan. Soldiers from Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Gambia used their knowledge of tropical environments to outmaneuver Japanese forces who had dominated jungle warfare. Their ability to navigate dense forests, survive on limited supplies, and maintain morale in impossible conditions helped turn the tide in Southeast Asia. East African soldiers played equally crucial roles in the Horn of Africa campaign that knocked Italy out early. Ethiopian, Sudanese, Kenyan, and Ugandan forces didn't just support British operations. They led many successful attacks against Italian positions. The speed and effectiveness of this campaign freed up British resources for other fronts while demonstrating that African soldiers could defeat European armies. North African soldiers fought in the European theater. Moroccan, Algerian, and Tunisian troops were essential to liberating Italy and southern France. These soldiers fought in some of the war's bloodiest battles, including Monte Cassino and the Gothic Line, where their mountain warfare expertise proved invaluable. The irony was stark. Colonial subjects denied basic rights in peacetime were suddenly trusted with advanced weapons and dangerous missions. African soldiers proved their capabilities on every battlefield, often outperforming European counterparts in difficult conditions. African intelligence operations provided some of the war's most crucial information, and these contributions remained classified for decades. Africa's geography made it a natural intelligence hub. German U-boats operating in the Atlantic depended on supply networks along the African coast. Italian forces in North Africa required detailed knowledge of terrain and local populations. Japanese operations in the Indian Ocean relied on understanding African coastal defenses. African intelligence operatives working under cover as traders, fishermen, or migrant workers provided the Allies with real-time information about Axis movements that couldn't be obtained any other way. These networks operated across vast distances, using traditional communication methods nearly impossible for Axis forces to detect. Coastal intelligence networks were particularly valuable. African fishermen and traders had intimate knowledge of every bay and landing point along thousands of miles of coastline. When German submarines surfaced for supplies, African operatives were often first to report their locations. This information was crucial for Allied anti-submarine warfare that eventually broke the U-boat threat. In North Africa, local networks provided detailed information about German and Italian supply lines, troop movements, and defensive preparations. African operatives could move through areas where European agents would be immediately detected, gathering information crucial for Allied planning. What made African intelligence operations particularly effective was their integration with existing social and economic networks. Traders who had been moving goods across Africa for generations could now move information just as efficiently. Behind every Allied tank, aircraft, and ship were African raw materials that made victory possible. Africa provided over 75% of the gold that financed Allied war efforts. South African gold reserves allowed Britain to purchase American weapons through Lend-Lease programs that kept the war effort funded. Without this financial foundation, the massive Allied military buildup would have been impossible. Strategic minerals from Africa were equally crucial. The uranium that powered the Manhattan Project came primarily from Belgian Congo mines. Without African uranium, the atomic weapons that ended the Pacific War couldn't have been built. Chrome from southern Africa was essential for aircraft engines and tank armor. Copper from Central Africa powered communications networks coordinating Allied operations. African farms provided food sustaining Allied forces across multiple continents. Egyptian cotton supplied parachutes and uniforms. West African palm oil was essential for producing explosives. East African sisal provided rope for naval operations. What made these contributions particularly significant was their reliability. While European production was constantly threatened by bombing and invasion, African supplies remained secure throughout the war. This stability allowed Allied planners to count on consistent supply flows that made long-term strategic planning possible. The treatment of African soldiers during and after the war reveals the ugly contradictions at the heart of the Allied cause. While African soldiers were fighting for freedom and democracy, they experienced systematic discrimination that made a mockery of the values they were supposedly defending. African troops were often paid less than their European counterparts for doing the same jobs. They received inferior equipment, medical care, and living conditions. Most insulting of all, many African soldiers were denied the recognition and medals they had earned through their service. The segregation was particularly harsh in mixed units. African soldiers who had proven their courage and competence in combat were still treated as second-class participants in the war effort. They couldn't eat in the same facilities, sleep in the same quarters, or receive the same medical treatment as European soldiers fighting alongside them. The irony was devastating. African soldiers were literally fighting against Nazi racial ideology while experiencing racial discrimination from their own commanders. They were defending democratic values while being denied basic democratic rights in their own colonies. Perhaps most tragically, many African veterans returned home to find that their military service counted for nothing in the colonial system. Veterans who had commanded units and made life-or-death decisions in combat were expected to return to their previous subordinate positions in colonial society. The skills they had developed, the leadership they had demonstrated, and the sacrifices they had made were simply ignored. The psychological impact was profound. African soldiers had experienced a wider world, worked alongside Europeans as equals, and proven their capabilities in the most demanding circumstances possible. Returning to colonial restrictions after experiencing relative freedom created tensions that would eventually explode into independence movements across the continent. The end of World War II marked the beginning of systematic amnesia about African contributions to Allied victory. During the war, Allied leaders had made grand promises about freedom, self-determination, and equality that seemed to include colonial populations. The Atlantic Charter spoke of the right of all peoples to choose their own governments. Roosevelt and Churchill proclaimed that they were fighting for universal human rights and democratic values. African soldiers and civilians who had sacrificed for these ideals expected that victory would bring meaningful change to colonial relationships. Instead, European powers returned to business as usual, often using the same African soldiers who had fought for freedom to suppress independence movements in their own countries. The historical record was systematically sanitized to minimize African contributions. Official histories focused on European and American achievements while relegating African participation to footnotes. War memorials commemorated European sacrifices while ignoring African losses. Victory parades in London and Paris featured European troops, while African veterans were excluded. This wasn't accidental forgetfulness. It was deliberate historical revision designed to preserve colonial relationships by minimizing evidence of African capabilities and contributions. Acknowledging that Africans had been crucial to Allied victory would have undermined colonial justifications that portrayed Africans as incapable of self-governance. The economic promises were equally hollow. African colonies that had provided crucial resources during the war found themselves even more economically exploited afterward. The infrastructure built to support war efforts was redirected to serve colonial extraction rather than African development. Despite the betrayal and discrimination, World War II fundamentally transformed African societies in ways that made independence inevitable. Military service had exposed over 1 million Africans to new ideas, technologies, and organizational models. Soldiers returned home with technical skills, leadership experience, and expanded worldviews that colonial systems couldn't contain. Many future independence leaders were World War II veterans who applied military organizational principles to political movements. The economic changes were equally significant. Wartime production had created new industries, urban centers, and commercial networks that operated independently of traditional colonial structures. African businesses that had supplied war efforts continued operating afterward, creating economic foundations for eventual independence. Most importantly, the ideological impact was transformative. Africans had fought for democracy and freedom, making it impossible for colonial powers to deny these same values to African populations. The contradictions between wartime rhetoric and post-war reality created intellectual frameworks that justified independence movements. The international context had also shifted. The United States and Soviet Union, the war's biggest winners, both opposed European colonialism for different reasons. African independence movements could now appeal to global superpowers rather than relying solely on European colonial powers for political change. The network effects were equally important. African soldiers had served alongside troops from dozens of countries, creating international relationships that transcended colonial boundaries. These connections would prove crucial for independence movements that needed international support and recognition. Today, historians are finally beginning to acknowledge what should have been obvious from the beginning. World War II couldn't have been won without massive African contributions that shaped the conflict's outcome. Their sacrifice deserves recognition not just as historical correction, but as acknowledgement of the universal human desire for freedom and dignity that transcends racial and national boundaries. African contributions to World War II demonstrate that the fight against fascism was truly a global effort that succeeded because people everywhere recognized the stakes involved. If you enjoyed learning about Africa's crucial but overlooked contributions to Allied victory in World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more hidden stories of African achievement that changed world history.